Thanks, Sid. Well, good morning. It's great to see y'all this morning. Actually, I'm going to set this over here. We are in a series called How the Mighty Fall. We would be tempted to say, well, we're going to talk about those folks out there, but the truth is how the mighty fall is how the people of God who start out often well and then they end up not so well. It's how do the people of God fall. And so I'm going to start out today with a little small game. It's called Would You Rather, okay? Would you rather? I'm going to ask you a question about would you rather, and you get to choose one. You don't have to holler it out, okay? Would you rather be rich or wealthy? Would you rather be rich or wealthy? Now, some of you are going, is there a difference? The truth is there is, okay? Here's my little chart here, all right? Rich folks have a high income, but wealthy folks, their income comes from their investments rather than their work. So you'll hear that a rich person works for their income, works for their money, but a wealthy person, their money works for them. All right? A rich person spends money so it's obvious they have money. That's kind of the idea of being rich, is I have the best of everything. Whereas wealthy folks spend money on things that make money or hold their value. So they're asking different questions. A rich person is saying, will this let everyone know I'm rich? A wealthy person is saying, will this continue to make me money? Or will this take my money away? A rich person has the best of everything, whereas a wealthy person has nice things, but it's in proportion to their income. In other words, they usually don't do a whole lot of debt, at least not the debt that actually builds income. Completely different thing. All right, so second question. Would you rather be smart or wise? Would you rather be smart or wise? Again, you might go, wait a second, is there a difference? And of course, there is. So here's, again, my chart, all right, on smart and wise. Smart folks try to conquer others. In other words, they're trying to let you know they're smart. Whereas wise folks, they try to conquer themselves. A smart person knows the right answers. A wise person, however, knows the right questions. A smart person is trying to be right. I spent a lot of my youth being a smart person. However, wise people do the right things. A smart person has the things they want, whereas a wise person has the things they need. A smart person is usually, it's something inherited, comes natural, but a wisdom can actually be developed, but it's developed through maturity and experience. So there are differences, and we're going to kind of talk about that nuance this week. All right. So last week, if you remember, the highlight was, or the kind of the main idea was, we watch for the Trojan horse, right? The Trojan horse is that whole thing where things seem to be going well, and then you let this thing in, and the next thing you know. So last week's Trojan horse was watch out for the Trojan horse of foreign loves. What you give your heart to, they come in sweet, but they eventually turn your heart sour. This week, we're going to say, watch out for the Trojan horse of a popular opinion. What's smart? It might be what you want to hear, but it's often not what you need to hear. And yes, there is a difference. So we're going to go to God's word, and we're going to talk about a smart, unwise king. A smart, unwise king. Before I hop into his story, I want to give you a little background. This goes right from last week. If you remember, Solomon gave his heart to foreign gods. His heart began to grow cold, not completely cold to God, but it began to grow cold to God. And in the midst of that, God said, that's going to have consequences. And later on in chapter 11, we begin to see those consequences, and people raise up and they begin to challenge his authority and have problems. And then it begins to tell this story about this guy named Jeroboam. All right, so in verse 28 of 1 Kings 11, it says this. Now Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man, so he's a young man, could be a teenager probably, how this young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the house of Joseph. So he was in charge of all Solomon's projects. And if you know anything about Solomon, he did a lot. This guy was in charge. And then just a few verses later, he's out and about, and God sends a prophet to Jeroboam. And it says this in verse 30, and Ahijah, that's the prophet, took hold of the new cloak that he was wearing, and he tore it into 12 pieces. So he took this cloak, he tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, take 10 pieces for yourself. Of course, Jeroboam does. He's kind of going, this is kind of weird. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I'm going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand, and I'm going to give you 10 tribes. So God is choosing Jeroboam. He says, this kingdom is going to divide, and you're going to get 10 of the 12 tribes. Remember, there's these 12 different families that all make up the one nation. And the end result of this is somehow Solomon hears this, verse 40, and he tries to kill Jeroboam. But Jeroboam fled to Egypt, to Shishak the king, and stayed there until Solomon's death. So that's the background. You get this, Solomon, the kingdom's going to split, Jeroboam's going to be the guy, he runs off. And then as we open 1 Kings chapter 12, Solomon has died, right? And so now it's time for a new king. And his son that's supposed to inherit it is a son Rehoboam. So in verse 1 of chapter 12, it says this, Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all the Israelites had gone there, what? To make him king. That was their intention. God had extremely blessed the Israelites through a little bit through Saul, and then a lot through David, and then even more, believe it or not, through Solomon. And to a certain degree, it was working, and so they came together to do that. But before they were to officially appoint him king, there was a decision that needed to be made. And so all the leaders gathered together with this potential new king that they intend to make king, Rehoboam. Picks up in verse 3, it says, so they sent for Jeroboam. So Jeroboam, remember, he went off, but he's liked by the Israelites. And I'll just give you a clue. It's because he was over labor, and he probably was a good labor boss, and the guy who followed him was not. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam, and they said to him, listen, your father, that's Solomon, put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor. This is why Jeroboam was called back. We want to go back to how Jeroboam was leading. And the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. So what they're saying is, see, the king is the king, and you can't challenge his authority. And so when he wants to build something, he needs a certain amount of workers. And so he tells every tribe, you have to provide 1,000 men. You have to provide 2,000 men. You have to provide these resources. And Solomon, even though they were blessed, remember, silver had no value because there was so much of it, right? He was really free with making everybody do what he wanted them to do, right? Because he was all after that pleasure stuff. We talked about that last week. So they say, listen, if you just lighten the load, we will serve you, right? And so he actually makes a smart decision. He says, give me a few days. Let me consider your request, and I'll let you know. And so they all take off. And so he does dutifully what, he's about to be the new king, so he does dutifully what he should do. He calls all the advisors that advised his father Solomon, men who are much, much older than him, been around a lot, and he asked them, hey, what should I do? And in verse 7, it says this, they replied, if today you will be a servant, I know you're about to be king, but if you'll be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. They're saying, listen, I understand this is a big request, and you are going to be the king. They need to do what you say. But if today you choose to serve them, then not only tomorrow, but throughout your king, they will serve you. They will see you as a good guy. Now, right after this, in verse 8, it says that he rejected what they told him. Now, but he's going to be king, so he knows he can't, even though he has the right to just reject them, he's like, nobody will take that as face value. So I know what I'll do. I'll ask my other elders what they think. I didn't get the right answer over here, so I'll just go over here and I'll just get a second opinion. And so he asked them, and in verse 10 it says, the young men who had grown up with him replied, and these are they're also considered elders. They have been trained in wisdom and advice and all this kind of stuff. And they said this, tell these people who have said to you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make your yoke lighter. Tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. In other words, their advice is, listen, Show them who's boss. Who are they? They're the people. You're the king. We're the ruling elite. We're the smart ones. We're the educated ones. We're the ones who knows what's right. Tell them they can't speak to you like that. They can't treat you like that. Stand up to them. That's their advice. And just like Rehoboam, they're young, ambitious, proud, and insecure. And you can see it in their advice. They tell Rehoboam what they want to hear. Now, I want to remind you, I'm cheating, right? Because the whole idea of this talk is watch out for the Trojan horse of a popular opinion. It might be what you want to hear, but often is not what you need to hear. But it's what Rehoboam wanted to hear. From the very beginning, it's what he wanted to hear. And so he calls the people back, and based on what he wanted to hear, he gives that harsh answer. And the people themselves, the leaders, are trying to say, dude, back up. Okay, this is me speaking. He didn't say dude or back up. But they were like, really? And he was like, really? And here's the result, verse 16. When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, what share do we have in David? Now remember, David is really from just one of the 12 families. What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, O Israel. So everybody else, all the other tribes, all the other families, go back. Look after your own house, O David. You rule over you. So the Israelites then went home. The end result is the king is rejected and the kingdom is split. He even tries, it looks like a compromise. He sends the guy who's over labor either to work out a deal or tell them you're going to go to work, and they stone the guy. And at this point, Rehoboam realizes he listened to the wrong advice. He has to hop on his chariot and run back to Jerusalem. You see, what he did not know, and he was very well educated, he was a very smart man, he had the best education of anybody at that time, is that you need to watch out for the Trojan horse of a popular opinion. It might be what you want to hear, but it's often not what you need to hear. So in this last little part, what I want to talk about is what does it look like to develop wisdom? What does it look like to develop wisdom? All right? So number one, learn the difference between good advice and wisdom. And there is a huge difference between good advice and wisdom. I don't have to tell you, especially for those of you who are young, right? There are a million opinions out there about what you should do and how you should do it and what's good for you. And unlike any of the time that anybody else here went through, they are more accessible and they actually sound slicker than they did in our day. And they were pretty slick in our day. But the stuff that you guys have to sort through is just insane. It's just crazy. But it is what it is. So the question is, what do we do about that? Right? So the difference between good advice and wisdom. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, thankfully, I'm sure. So let me just give this. By the way, this is all on the app. So if you're taking notes, it's already there online. All right? Good advice considers what is going to feel right. When someone gives you advice and you go, oh yeah, that makes sense to me, be careful. Be careful, because wisdom considers what is right despite your feelings. Let me tell you something about wisdom. Wisdom often is against what you want to do and what feels right. Okay? I'm going to tell you something that you probably will never hear anywhere else. Don't follow your heart. Don't follow your heart. Now, sometimes you have two equally good things. Great. Follow your heart. Follow your heart. But I can tell you, we don't have time for it. I won't take the time. I could have these folks who have lived life stand up and tell you how they followed their heart and they ended up in a bad marriage. They followed their heart and they ended up addicted. They followed their heart and they ended up in jail, or they ended up in a broken relationship. They ended up in a lot of places. Why? Because they followed what they thought was right, what felt good at the time. Good advice looks primarily at the immediate effect. How's it going to be right now? This is, by the way, the advice you're going to get from your friends. And never take the advice of your friend's older brother or sister. They know they're like 16. They're 21. No, they don't. No, they don't. And the reason I can tell you that is because I was 16 and 21 and really, really smart, and I was an idiot. I just didn't know it. See, wisdom looks at the overall outcome over time. And by the way, a 21 doesn't know the overall outcome over the time because they haven't lived any time, especially on their own. Listen to this. I'm sorry, this is going to come up on the screen, but just listen. If you need it, just come to me afterwards and I'll repeat it to you. A wise person doesn't get into the trouble that a smart person can get out of. A wise person doesn't get into the trouble that a smart person can get out of. So you have a lot of smart people who are like, oh, if you get in trouble, I can just get out. A wise person just doesn't put themselves in that situation in the first place. Good advice often comes across as engaging and sweet. It's the best TikTok. It's the slickest thing on YouTube. It's the news that makes you laugh and engages you, right? But wisdom often comes across as matter of fact and quite frankly boring. Because it's not trying to impress you, it's trying to help you. And there's a difference. Wisdom doesn't have something to sell, it has something to offer, whereas good advice usually has something to sell. And even if the sell is, I want you to believe and think like me. Good advice tells you how you get what you want, where wisdom tells you how to become what you really want to be. And there's a difference. The British writer Frank Boham says this: we make our decisions, and then our decisions turn around and make us. Think about that. We make our decisions, left or right, good or bad, study, don't study, take it or don't take it, go there, do that job, don't do that job, and then whatever decision we make makes us. And it's a cumulative effect. That doesn't mean you can't undo a bad decision, it just means you have to work hard to undo a bad decision. So learn the difference between good advice and wisdom. Number 2, be aware of itching ears syndrome. Itching ear syndrome. By the way, I don't think you'll find this on the internet, itching ear syndrome. I made it up. But it does come from a verse in the Bible. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3 says this: for the time will come when men and women will not put up with sound doctrine. Boy, we are living in this day and time. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. By the way, the context of this is inside the church. Yes. It's not talking about the world, it's talking about inside the church. So no matter what you want to do, no matter what you want to believe, you will find a church, you will find a pastor out there who will tell you what you want to hear. The question you have to ask is this wisdom? Is it wisdom? But many of us choose the church, the Bible study, the music, the spiritual experience we want that will tell us what our itching ears want to hear, rather than what our soul really needs, what we really need. And by the way, society is set up to encourage this syndrome, to tell people what they want to hear. You all know how this works, right? If you're young, you know that TikTok, if you watch 2 TikToks on the same subject that agree with each other, from then on, what comes up on your page? TikToks that always say that kind of thing. If you like little cute kittens, cute kittens, cute kittens, cute kittens, cute kittens. Right? If you like a certain idea, Facebook's the same way. Right? Facebook's the same way. And the funny thing is that when you get on Facebook, if you actually talk about anything other than your children, right, what you will find out is over time, the people that begin to react to your posts are only people who agree with your posts. There might be one friend that you have that's on the opposite aisle and you guys kind of go back and forth. But other than that, people tell you what you hear. Most of us watch a news station that tells us the kind of news we want to hear. That's itching ears syndrome. Itching ears syndrome. I just want to hear what I want to hear. And it must be true because it feels right. It must be true because it agrees with me. Let me give the last point of developing wisdom by giving you a story. It's not original to me. It's written by Max Lucado. It's actually a children's book, which I absolutely positively love. It's called the Song of the King. And I'm going to give you the short version of the Song of the King. And the worship team's going to come up and get ready to play, so you know I got to be short. There are 3 knights sitting at a table with the prince. He has called them in. They are anxiously waiting. What is this about? The king and the prince don't just call you in for nothing. And the prince sits down and he says, "Gentlemen, the day has come. As you know, the princess fancies each of you. And the king has decided on a test. Which one of you ever wins the test gets the princess's hand in marriage." How romantic. So as you can imagine, all the princes, all these knights want to know, what do I have to do? And he says, all you need to do, he says, is you need to travel through the forest of hemlock. And all of a sudden, all the princes kind of get a little serious, because this is a big deal. See, this forest was dark, and it was filled with these sly creatures with yellow eyes called the hope knots. And for one of the first questions from one of the knights, Carlisle he was known as the strongest, he's best with the sword. He says, "Do we go alone?" Now that might seem weird from such a strong guy, but he knew how dangerous this forest was. And the prince says, "No, you each can choose one companion." And then Alon, who's the fastest, right? You think he's there, and all of a sudden he's over there. He's hard to catch. He's very sly. He asks, well, how do we know the way? Because there are no paths that go through the forest. And the prince says, you need to follow the song. And then he pulls out his flute and he plays the song. And he says, every day the king, who's the only other one who has a flute like this, will play this song. And you need to follow that song. And then the last night, Cassadon, the wisest, asks, and there's only 2 flutes like that one, you and the king. And he said, yes. And so the next day, all decked out in their knightly armor and whatnot, they go into the forest. Everyone's waiting on the other side at the castle. Days go by. And then finally, somebody comes stumbling out of the castle. Everybody's wondering, who is that? Who is that? Some think it's Carlisle, the strongest. Some think it's Alnon, the swiftest. Some think it's Cassadon, the wisest. But they don't know, and he is swifted away and said, tonight we will present him to you. So everyone gathers. This is kind of like we're gathering, and all of a sudden, the king, like he did every single day, gets up and he plays this flute one last time. And the doors open, and the person who walks to the back is Cassadon, the wisest. And he comes forward, and there's this talk, and they're like, what was it like? And he begins to describe, they go in, and the first things that the creatures do is they steal their horses, and so they end up on foot. And then in the middle of the night, when they were resting with their armor, they stole their armor, and then their swords and their food, and they had no provisions. He says, but that wasn't the worst of it. And they're like, what is the worst? He says, every day when the king would play his flute, he says, the hope knots would play a flute as well. Thousands of flutes all around us. And it was hard to know which way to go. They asked him what happened to Carlisle and Alon. He said, I do not know. What I do know is this: is strength and quickness will not help you if you don't know which way to go. And so finally the princess asked the question everybody wanted to know, how did you make it through? And Cassadon's answer is, I picked the right companion. And then he turned around and he motioned for the companion to come forward. And to everyone's surprise, it was the prince. And Cassadon went on to explain, he says, said that there was only other one who had a flute and could play like the king was the prince. And so every morning I had the prince play the song. And I learned the song. And I had to play it again. So though 1,000 or 10,000 flutes would play, I knew the song of the king. Yes, there are thousands and many voices out there. But a wise person will learn the song of the king and know the difference between smart good, terrible advice, and the king's advice. Watch out for the Trojan horse of popular opinion. It might be what you want to hear, but it's often not what you need to hear. Father God, may that be true of us. Help us with that, dear God. And thank you, dear Lord, for these new lives we're about to celebrate here soon in baptism. And we pray, dear God, that as they start well, as they start mighty, that they will not fall. They will not fall for the tricks of our enemy, who would have them go 1,000 different directions other than the direction of the King. Help us in that. Help us help each other in that. In the name of the Prince, Jesus, who is the Christ, I pray. Amen.